In an age without electricity, engines, or modern machinery, medieval builders managed to construct some of the most breathtaking structures the world has ever seen, cathedrals that still stand tall today. But how did they do it? How did ordinary men and women in the Middle Ages lift stones heavier than cars and create intricate designs that reach towards the heavens? In this video, we're going back in time to uncover the secrets of medieval cathedral construction, and you might just come away more impressed than ever by human ingenuity. Before a single stone was lifted, the journey of building a cathedral began with something invisible yet essential, a vision. This vision belonged to the master mason, the lead architect, engineer, and project manager all rolled into one. In an era without formal blueprints, standardized tools, or digital models, these master builders relied on an extraordinary combination of experience, geometry, faith, and intuition to design structures that would soar toward the heavens. Designing a cathedral was not merely a technical endeavor, it was a spiritual one. Every curve, line, and measurement carried symbolic meaning. The layout of the cathedral itself was often shaped like a cross, with the nave, transept, and choir forming its arms and body. The building was meant to reflect the order of heaven, the majesty of God, and the path of salvation. It was theology in stone, designed to inspire awe, humility, and reverence. But how did they turn divine inspiration into practical design? The answer lies in a blend of medieval mathematics and sacred geometry. Even without modern measuring devices, these builders had access to incredibly precise knowledge passed down through generations. Much of it was based on Euclidean geometry, preserved through Arabic translations and monastic scholars. Shapes like circles, squares, and triangles weren't just aesthetic. They held structural and symbolic significance. The circle represented eternity, unity, and the divine, while the square symbolized the earthly realm. Through clever ratios and proportional relationships, master masons could maintain harmony and balance throughout their designs. They sketched these complex ideas on parchment, wooden tablets, or even scratched them directly into slabs of stone or onto the floors of their workshops. Sometimes they used a tool called the tracing floor, a large flat surface where full-size patterns of arches and windows were laid out with chalk or charcoal. This hands-on approach allowed the builders to visualize, adjust, and communicate their plans to the teams of craftsmen who would eventually bring them to life. What's remarkable is that these designs often included structural innovations well ahead of their time. The Gothic cathedral, for instance, introduced features like pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, each one playing a critical role in distributing weight and allowing cathedrals to rise higher and higher without collapsing under their own weight. These features didn't appear overnight. They were the result of trial and error, adaptation, and the collective wisdom of generations of builders. In addition to the technical drawings and calculations, the master mason had to take into account the surrounding environment. The cathedral had to be oriented properly, often aligned so that the altar faced east toward Jerusalem and the rising sun, a symbol of resurrection and divine light. The terrain needed to be carefully surveyed to ensure the foundation would be strong enough to support tons of stone. Builders sometimes drove wooden stakes into the earth and used cords and basic levels to map out the precise angles and boundaries of the future cathedral. And perhaps most importantly, the master mason had to manage ambition. Cathedrals were not small projects. Some were intended to be the tallest buildings in the known world. But the builder also knew he would likely never see the final result. These were projects that spanned decades, even centuries. What mattered more than speed was legacy. A design had to be robust enough to outlast its maker and flexible enough for future generations to continue the work long after the original vision was gone. In many ways, the act of designing a cathedral in the Middle Ages was a form of faith itself. It required belief in the divine, in mathematics, in stone, and in the hands of countless unknown laborers. The master mason planted a seed whose fruit would not be seen for generations, but whose shadow would stretch across the centuries. Once the design was complete and approved, often by religious authorities or wealthy patrons who financed the construction, the next monumental task began: Sourcing the materials. This was no small feat. Unlike today, where construction materials are delivered in bulk by trucks and cranes, medieval builders had to rely on human strength, animal power, and sheer determination to gather everything needed, and they needed a lot. The primary material for cathedral construction was stone, heavy, durable, and symbolically eternal. But stone couldn't simply be picked up off the ground. It had to be quarried, a process that began with identifying the right type of stone in the right location. Limestone was particularly favored across much of Europe because it was both strong and workable. In other regions, granite, sandstone, or marble might be used depending on local geology. Each stone had its own character, and master masons often adjusted their designs based on what materials were available. Once a quarry site was selected, the laborious process of extraction began. Workers used iron picks, wedges, and hammers to chip away at the rock face. Sometimes, they drove wooden pegs into natural cracks in the stone, then soaked them with water. As the wood expanded, it exerted pressure on the rock, splitting it in large, usable blocks. This technique, though simple, was remarkably effective and shows the ingenuity of pre-industrial labor. But the real challenge wasn't just cutting the stone, it was transporting it. Many quarries were miles away from the cathedral site. Some were located on hillsides or across rivers, requiring a coordinated logistical effort. Workers loaded massive stone blocks onto sledges, wooden platforms that could be dragged over dirt paths or snow. If the terrain allowed, they would use log rollers underneath the sledges, reducing friction and allowing oxen or horses to pull the stones with less effort. In some cases, entire roads were built or maintained just to support the movement of these heavy materials. Water transport, when available, was a huge advantage. Rivers and canals were the highways of the Middle Ages. Stones could be floated downstream on barges, saving both time and labor. However, loading and unloading these barges presented new challenges and required carefully constructed docks and skilled workers to guide the process. Even with all this effort, it could take weeks to move a single shipment of stone from quarry to site. And stone was only the beginning. Timber played a crucial role in construction, not only for scaffolding and roofing, but also for molds used in shaping arches and vaults. Oak was highly prized for its strength and resistance to rot. Trees were felled with axes, trimmed with adzes, and hauled through forests by teams of oxen. Entire forests could be cleared just to supply the wood for a single cathedral. The demand was so high that some regions eventually imposed restrictions on tree felling to protect dwindling supplies. Other essential materials included iron, used to make tools, reinforcement bars, clamps, and nails, and lead, which was vital for roofing and stained glass windows. These metals had to be mined, smelted, and then transported, adding yet another layer of complexity. Miners dug deep into the earth with picks and chisels, often working in dangerous and suffocating conditions. Smelting the ore required large amounts of charcoal, creating a chain of labor that extended far beyond the visible cathedral site. Even sand, lime, and clay had to be sourced carefully. Lime, when burned and mixed with water and sand, became mortar, the binding glue of the cathedral. Improper ratios could weaken the structure, so medieval builders paid close attention to the quality and composition of their ingredients. This entire operation required intense coordination, planning, and manpower. There were no cell phones or spreadsheets. Orders and instructions were carried by messengers. Delays were common. Weather, war, illness, or broken carts could set back deliveries by weeks or months. Yet the construction never truly stopped. Each stone that arrived was a small miracle of logistics, a triumph of patience and persistence. And let's not forget the human cost. This was grueling physical labor. Men toiled under the sun and rain, pulling carts, lifting stones, navigating mud, snow, and uneven ground. Injuries were common, and exhaustion was a daily companion. Yet many of these laborers saw their work as a sacred duty. Building a cathedral wasn't just a job. It was a form of devotion, a way to serve God and leave something eternal behind. Through all these efforts, the foundations of Europe's greatest cathedrals were slowly assembled, not just from stone and timber, but from the collective will of entire communities. They pulled, carved, loaded, and lifted, driven by purpose and faith. And brick by brick, stone by stone, they raised monuments that would inspire awe for generations to come. Once the raw materials had arrived at the construction site, after enduring the treacherous journey from quarry, forest, or mine, the next stage of cathedral building could begin. But without electricity, hydraulic machines, or modern conveniences, how did medieval builders actually shape and assemble these enormous resources into something so intricate, majestic, and enduring? The answer lies in a surprisingly effective collection of hand tools, clever techniques, and ancient knowledge passed down through generations. To the modern eye, the medieval construction site might look primitive, but to those who understood the tools of the trade, it was a symphony of coordination and craftsmanship. At the heart of this effort were the stone masons. These were not mere laborers, they were highly trained artisans. Apprentices often began their training in childhood, learning how to read the stone with their fingers and eyes. With chisels, mallets, pickaxes, and hammers, they transformed rough blocks into precisely carved components, each tailored for its place in the structure, whether as part of an arch, column, or intricate facade. Chisels came in many shapes and sizes, each suited to a different stage of the process. The point chisel was used first to break off large chunks and establish the basic shape. Next came the tooth chisel, which refined the surface and helped reveal the natural grain of the stone. Finally, the flat chisel was used to smooth and perfect. Every tool had a purpose, and the work was painstaking, often taking hours or even days to complete a single piece. Equally important were the carpenters, who created the wooden skeleton of the construction process. They built the scaffolding that allowed workers to climb higher and higher as the walls rose. They crafted the complex centering frames needed to construct arches and vaults. These temporary wooden molds were crucial, because until the final keystone was placed, an arch was structurally unstable. Once complete, the wooden frames could be removed, and the stone structure would hold its own weight, thanks to the precise placement and angling of each stone. To guide their work, medieval builders relied on simple yet ingenious measuring tools. The plumb bob, a pointed weight suspended on a string, was used to establish true vertical lines. Squares and straight edges helped keep angles exact. The compass allowed for perfect curves and circles, which were vital in the Gothic style. These tools were not just for show. They were vital instruments in a world where the smallest miscalculation could lead to catastrophic failure. Another unsung hero of the medieval job site was the tread wheel crane. This large wooden device resembled a giant hamster wheel. Inside, a laborer would walk, turning the wheel and winding up a rope attached to a pulley system. With enough manpower, these cranes could lift multi-ton stones to heights of 100 feet or more. Treadwheel cranes were often mounted atop the scaffolding itself, moving with the builders as they progressed upward. Their strength came not from engines or motors, but from leverage, balance, and the relentless rhythm of human effort. Even more subtle was the use of ramps and hoists. Long wooden ramps were constructed around and through the rising structure, allowing workers to push carts or sledges loaded with stone to their destination. Pulley systems, made from rope and wood, multiplied human force. Some used counterweights to offset the mass of the object being lifted, an early form of mechanical advantage. Every system was based on physics, even if the builders didn't express it in equations. Metalworkers also played a crucial role. Though the cathedral was primarily built from stone and wood, iron clamps, pins, and dowels were embedded into the masonry to secure key joints. These metal reinforcements helped stabilize the structure, especially in high-stress areas like arches and towers. The smiths who forged these pieces used bellows-powered forges to achieve the high heat necessary for working iron, a dangerous and skilled profession in itself. As the building rose, so did the complexity of the work. It wasn't just about stacking stones, it was about creating vast, open interiors filled with light, harmony, and symbolism. Windows had to be prepared to house stained glass, which was another world of craftsmanship entirely. Frames had to be shaped to precise curvature. Grooves were carved to hold lead cames, the channels that would support the vibrant colored glass. These weren't just decorative elements, they were theological statements in light and color, telling biblical stories for a largely illiterate population. All of this required coordination, communication, and trust. There were no blueprints pinned to the wall. Instead, the master mason had to rely on memory, experience, and verbal instructions to guide dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers. Errors were corrected in real time. Adjustments were made by eye and hand. And despite the apparent chaos of the construction site, everything moved according to an unwritten but deeply understood rhythm. One of the most fascinating aspects of the tools and techniques used during this period is that they were both simple and enduring. In fact, many of the tools found in a modern stonemason's toolkit are not that different from those used 800 years ago. What has changed is the power behind them, not necessarily the principles. Ultimately, the tools of the medieval builder were an extension of the human hand, mind, and spirit. They were not powered by engines, but by patience, precision, and purpose. Every chisel mark, every joint fitted without mortar, every wooden scaffold balanced delicately against the wind, these were acts of devotion. Through simple tools and sheer skill, medieval craftsmen achieved something extraordinary. They reached for the heavens, and somehow they touched them. Raising a cathedral was not just a matter of building walls. It was about lifting an entire vision toward the sky. The moment the structure began to climb above the foundations, the true challenge began. How do you lift stones weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds into the air and position them with such precision that they not only stay in place, but create arches, vaults, and spires that can survive the test of centuries? This was where medieval ingenuity met its greatest test. Builders had to find ways to defy gravity without the help of cranes, forklifts, or steel beams. And they did, using physics, geometry, and raw human labor to craft soaring structures that seemed to float above the earth. As the walls began to rise, scaffolding was constructed alongside them, wooden frameworks made of poles, planks, and braces, extending upward with each new level. These scaffolds had to be sturdy enough to support workers, tools, and materials, but also flexible enough to be assembled, disassembled, and rebuilt as needed. This ever-changing network of wooden walkways and platforms became the lifeline of the construction site. But scaffolding alone couldn't solve the central problem, lifting massive stones to increasing heights. That's where the treadwheel crane became essential. Often mounted at the top of the scaffolding, these cranes were powered entirely by human or animal effort. A man would walk inside a giant wooden wheel, essentially a human hamster wheel, causing the wheel to rotate and wind a rope around a drum. The rope, attached to a pulley system, lifted the stone block slowly but steadily upward. The system required balance, coordination, and constant attention. A single misstep could mean a falling stone and a deadly accident. These cranes could be rotated and repositioned to lift stones at various points around the building, and multiple cranes might be in use at once, each operated by its own team. The lifting process was slow, but it was astonishingly effective. Some of these machines could raise several tons of stone, dozens of feet into the air, with remarkable precision. Counterweights and guide ropes were often used to stabilize the load and ensure that it could be maneuvered into its final position. Once the stone was hoisted, workers had to set it perfectly into place. There was no room for error. A misaligned stone could compromise an entire arch or vault. To guide the placement, masons used chalk lines, levels, and specially designed templates. They would chip and shape each stone by hand until it locked into place with its neighbors like a puzzle piece. This process was repeated over and over, hundreds, even thousands of times, as the walls stretched upward and the interior space began to take shape. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Gothic architecture was the use of ribbed vaults. These were not just decorative flourishes, they were brilliant structural solutions that allowed cathedrals to span vast interior spaces without needing thick, solid walls. Ribbed vaults consisted of intersecting stone arches that formed a skeleton or framework. Into the spaces between the ribs, lighter stone or brick was fitted, distributing the weight evenly and directing pressure down into the supporting columns. These vaults allowed cathedrals to reach new heights, both literally and symbolically. They lifted the ceiling, drawing the eyes upward and giving worshippers the feeling that they were entering the realm of heaven itself. But building them was no easy task. Temporary wooden scaffolds called centrings were erected to hold the ribs in place until the keystone, the final central stone, was installed. Once the keystone was in place, the entire structure became self-supporting, and the centering could be removed. But even with ribbed vaults and solid columns, the weight of the building was immense, and that weight didn't just press downward, it pushed outward, threatening to collapse the walls. The solution? The flying buttress, an architectural innovation that redefined what was possible. These graceful arching supports extended from the upper walls of the cathedral to massive piers or towers some distance away. They absorbed the lateral forces of the vaults and roof, transferring the pressure away from the delicate stained glass-filled walls. At first glance, flying buttresses might seem like external decoration, but they were key to the structural integrity of the cathedral. Their elegant form masked a powerful function. Without them, the walls would buckle and fall. Thanks to this design, builders could open up the walls with massive windows, filling the interior with light and color. The spiritual and the structural had become one. And then came the spires, those towering symbols of aspiration that crowned many cathedrals. Spires were more than mere decoration. They were triumphs of balance and design, often requiring incredibly precise calculations to ensure they didn't topple under their own weight or in strong winds. Built from stone or wood and often covered in lead or copper, they were assembled level by level, each stage lifted by crane and set into place with painstaking care. The construction of a spire could take decades in itself. Workers labored hundreds of feet in the air, exposed to the elements, fitting stones as carefully as they would at ground level. Each new height brought new challenges: wind, instability, the swaying of the scaffolding. Yet the work continued, inch by inch, until the final cross or weather vane was set high above the city, an unmistakable sign that the work of generations had finally reached its summit. Inside and out, lifting the cathedral was an act of faith and endurance. Every stone raised was a declaration of the human spirit's refusal to be grounded. Every arch and buttress, every spire and rib, was a testament to the belief that through labor, knowledge, and reverence, man could build something that reached not only toward the sky, but toward the divine. While the architecture and engineering of medieval cathedrals are awe-inspiring, perhaps the most profound aspect of their construction lies in the human story behind them. These towering monuments were not just the result of clever designs or stone-cutting techniques. They were the product of entire communities united by purpose, faith, and sacrifice. Every block of stone, every pane of stained glass, and every wooden beam was touched by hands that believed they were contributing to something greater than themselves, something eternal. Unlike modern construction projects, which are often completed in a few years, cathedrals took decades, even centuries, to build. The great cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, Chartres, Canterbury, were multi-generational undertakings. The man who laid the foundation would never live to see the vaults completed. The child who watched his father shape stone might grow old, still working on the same cathedral. Entire lifetimes were spent in the service of a single building. This extended timeline meant that cathedrals became woven into the very fabric of local life. They were not distant monuments overseen by outsiders, but living projects that employed townspeople, attracted pilgrims, and shaped the daily rhythm of the city. At any given time, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people worked on the site. Stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, glassmakers, laborers, apprentices, cooks, and more. Each had a role to play. Each carried the weight of a dream that they might never see fulfilled. For many of these workers, the labor was backbreaking and often dangerous. There were no safety harnesses, hard hats, or labor laws. Falls from scaffolding were not uncommon. Heavy stones could crush limbs. Accidents in the quarry or forge could mean disfigurement or death. Yet workers pressed on, day after day, motivated by more than wages. To build a cathedral was to engage in a sacred act, an offering of sweat, skill, and time to the glory of God. And it wasn't only the skilled artisans who made these achievements possible. The entire town participated in one way or another. Farmers brought food to the workers, women prepared meals and maintained households. Children might fetch water or deliver tools. Local churches and guilds donated money, materials, or manpower. It was a communal effort in the truest sense, each person contributing what they could to the realization of a vision that transcended individual lives. Even the funding of a cathedral was a community endeavor. While kings and bishops sometimes financed grand projects, many cathedrals were funded through donations from nobles, merchants, and even peasants. People gave whatever they could: a few coins, a sack of grain, a portion of land. It wasn't uncommon for a village to rally together to sponsor a stained glass window or a chapel within the cathedral. These acts of generosity weren't just financial, they were personal. Donors often requested that their names, or the names of their deceased loved ones, be inscribed into the stone or glass, ensuring that their memory would live on inside the sacred walls. In this way, the cathedral became not only a place of worship, but a repository of memory, a collective monument to the lives and dreams of those who built it. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, all were held within its growing walls. It was the backdrop to the town's most joyful celebrations and its darkest hours. It stood through famines, plagues, wars, and revolutions. And all the while, the building continued to rise, stone by stone, year by year, sheltering the hopes of those who had little yet gave so much. The emotional and spiritual investment was immense. To walk through a cathedral today is to feel the echoes of countless lives who gave everything to shape something beautiful. Their fingerprints are everywhere, in the wear on the staircases, in the slightly crooked carvings, in the quiet corners where light and shadow meet. These imperfections don't mar the grandeur, they enhance it. They remind us that behind every soaring arch is a person who once stood on that very spot, chisel in hand, heart full of purpose. And even when disaster struck, when fire, collapse, or war destroyed parts of the structure, the community would return, determined to rebuild. Sometimes this meant restarting the same section from scratch. Other times it meant adapting, innovating, or simplifying the original design. But never did the people give up. The building was a symbol of resilience, not just of architectural strength, but of human perseverance. In the end, what makes these cathedrals miraculous is not just their height or beauty, but the fact that they were built together, by people who believed in something they might never fully see. They worked not for profit or recognition, but for faith, legacy, and the hope that their children and their children's children would one day look up at the vaulted ceiling and feel awe. They gave their lives to a cause that was both divine and deeply human, to create a space where heaven and earth could meet,